Hello, everyone. Please hold on. We're going to wait a few more minutes before we get started. Vicki, you'll probably want to remain muted throughout the thing, so please go ahead and mute yourself.
Yeah, I don't know what happened here. I just have connected to go to webinar.
Yeah, so just go ahead and go down and mute yourself.
Okay.
In the, under attendees and staff.
Okay, well, maybe I need to log out and come back in because all I have is go to webinar. And then it says connected to go to webinar. Your session should begin shortly. You can close this window now.
All right, let me see if I can mute you. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Yeah, Vicki, I muted you, so you're all right. Welcome, everyone. Please hold on. We're going to wait a few more minutes for folks to continue to sign on, and then we will get started. Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait about one more minute to give some additional folks time to sign in, and then we will get started. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to FAFSA Training and Resources. On behalf of the Ohio Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, we would like to offer you today some training on how to complete a FAFSA in sort of a line-by-line review. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Maura Lee Keller, and I'm with the National College Attainment Network and also a member of the State Financial Aid Association. So I will be presenting part of the webinar today. My colleague Cody McMillan will take over and present the second part of the webinar today. And we have a couple of our financial aid administrators in the state of Ohio, Mary Cannon and Vicki DeLucas, on who will help answer questions. Just a couple housekeeping announcements. We will keep you all muted today. So that we can get through the presentation. We do have a lot of slides today, so we are going to strongly encourage you all to type your questions into the question box, and our financial aid experts will be reviewing your questions and typing the answers back in the box. If we have time at the end of today, we may take a few questions at the end of the webinar, but to make sure that we can get your questions answered, we want you to put them in the box and our experts will provide answers to you. So we'll appreciate you putting your questions in there. You are welcome to put any general financial aid questions as well. If you have some about the presentation, that's fine, but if you have other financial aid questions, you are welcome to put those in there. Okay, the first information here is that the material provided today is coming from OASFA, and you are welcome to use any of this information. And the good news for you is that we will post this actual webinar and simply the slide presentation on the OASFA webpage, the counselor resource page. So you will have access to that as well. Also in the handout section today, we uploaded a paper version of the FAFSA. We're using that just so that you can have a resource to take a look at if you want to, because the FAFSA obviously has all the questions, potential questions that a family could see. This webinar today is being brought to you by the Ohio Department of Higher Education. They with some of the federal emergency relief money as a result of the pandemic, they have put out a new FAFSA effort for the class of 21 to try to increase FAFSA completion for this year. They've made several grants to different community organizations around the state, almost $1 million to 23 different groups. They're supporting professional development like this webinar today, and allowing us to add these resources to our counselor page. One other thing that they will be doing is enhancing the FAFSA tracking system that you all pull down your student level data from. So speaking of FAFSA numbers, let's talk a little bit about where Ohio is right now. As of April 30th, Ohio is 12th in the country in FAFSA completion. So in overall comparison to other states, not too bad. However, being 12th in the country, we are still 6% behind in the number of FAFSAs completed compared to the class of 20 at this time last year. So that 6% literally represents thousands of FAFSAs that we are behind in the state of Ohio. At this point, only about 52% of the class has completed a FAFSA. So we're going to have to do a lot of assistance if we're going to increase those numbers and get back to near the 2020 levels by the end of the academic year. Nationally, the country is behind about 5.8%, so Ohio's a little farther behind than the national average. And nationally in the country, though, only 48.5% of the seniors have completed a FAFSA, so Ohio's a little ahead there. So that is, in some respects, good news, but we still have a long way to go. Today's webinar is going to be focused on completing the FAFSA, but one thing that we know is many of our students in the class of 2021 have delayed starting the entire college application process. And so we know that before you work on a FAFSA with your students, you're going to probably maybe be doing some counseling around choices, post-secondary choices, what still may be available. You know, those institutions are community colleges with open enrollment. There are still four-year institutions around the state that have openings for this fall. So helping students find a good fit and match for their choice for next year will be work that has to be done, and then work on completing the FAFSA. So let's talk about the FAFSA process. We know that this is a process that the majority of people in the country, well over 99% of the folks who complete a FAFSA do the FAFSA online and make it a completely online process. So to be able to do that, students, and if there are dependent students, at least one of the parents need to have what's referred to as a FSA ID or a Federal Student Aid ID. You can set those up at the website that you see here, fsaid.ed.gov. It is the username and password that they can use to log into their forms, to sign the form. Um, they have to have separate IDs when it comes to the parent and students, and they have to have separate information, separate email addresses, separate phone numbers. And so ideally, students or parents would set up their FSA ID, you know, in a sort of a normal year. You might be setting it up now if you were at the end of your junior year, so it would be ready to roll next October 1 when the FAFSA opens. So we would encourage anybody who's going to complete the FAFSA to get their FSA IDs set up as quickly as possible, so that they're ready to roll when they sit down and open up the form. Please note one thing that has you know, come out of using FSA IDs and using cell phone numbers is that we have reached a point in the country where there are recycled cell phone numbers. So if someone tries to set up an FSA ID and put their phone number in and they get a message that that already exists, they will probably have to reach out to an FSA specialist at the Department of Education who can help set up their FSA ID with that recycled phone number. Also, it asks for an email address. We encourage students not to use their high school email address because oftentimes those are deleted after graduation. All right, we've talked about the FAFSA being on the web. So here is the most common website that we're all used to using is FAFSA.gov. Federal student aid is in the process of merging all different kind of federal financial aid related websites into one place. And so actually when you type in FAFSA.gov, you're getting redirected to a website that has a much longer title, but that has to do with back-end mergers of the federal websites. You have an opportunity to view the FAFSA on the web in English or Spanish. You can also order a PDF version, a paper version, if for some reason someone does not have internet access or needs to use a paper version. It is available, but you have to either request it or go on and the FAFSA website and download the PDF so that you can use that and mail it in. As you know, the FAFSA opens October 1 every year. So last October 1, this FAFSA opened for our seniors who would be entering college this fall. So it has been open for several months and will remain open throughout this upcoming academic year. The information that is required on the FAFSA is often referred to as the prior year information. So for students who are completing the FAFSA for the 21-22 academic year, they will be putting in their 2019 income information, which, you know, we are just wrapping up 2009, you know, that tax season has been wrapped up. And so people should not have any trouble accessing that information to put on their form. So that's important to know that it is 2019 income information. All right, so if we would log into that FAFSA.gov website, please know that the screens that we're about to use are provided by federal student aid. So you'll see some examples indicating that the student is from Iowa and things like this. So these are sample screens that are available to folks and is available on the federal student aid website if you would want to go in and download the screenshots. The ones that we're going to use today are going to assume that a student is dependent and that we need parent information. So we will be showing parent screens as well. But this is the view you'll see when you first log in. Farther down the page, you'll have the opportunity to see if your state has a state grant program, which here in Ohio we do, the Ohio College Opportunity Grant. You can find out the deadline. The good news is the deadline for the Ohio College Opportunity Grant is this October 1 of 2021. So our Ohio students still have lots of time to file the FAFSA and, if eligible, be a recipient of the Ohio College Opportunity Grant. One of the interesting things that happens now when you do a FAFSA is you indicate at the beginning sort of who you are. So are you the parent who's going to be working on the form, or are you the student? So they'll click appropriately when they get ready to start the form. We talked about having that FSA ID, username and password, and here we go. It's one of the very first things that is going to be asked for to be entered into the system. So they would be putting their username and password in here so that they could continue on into the FAFSA. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner, the next button, that's the main form of navigating through the FAFSA website, is by using the next button. Then it's going to begin to collect some information. And here we have a sample screenshot where it's the parent who's starting the form. And so they have to enter the student's name, last name, the student's social security number, and the student's date of birth. So that's the way a parent would get in, because there would not, of course, be entering the student FSA ID and password. Simply disclaimer information that you would see on the form, something that can be read quickly. Everybody needs to click on accept to be able to move forward in the FAFSA. What is important is to make sure that students are completing the FAFSA for the correct academic year. So at any given point in time, there are always going to be 2 FAFSAs available. The 2021 FAFSA will disappear June 30th, but will still be up and available for another 6 weeks or so. But our students that are finishing high school right now want to click start the 2021-2022 FAFSA so that they can move on into the one for this coming academic year. It gives you an opportunity at the beginning to create a save key. This would be in case you start the FAFSA and for some reason can't finish and you'll need to log out. So this is kind of like a password that will get you back in to your form. Oftentimes, you know, you want students to use something really familiar. They can do something as simple as their first name, for example, as a save key, so that in case they would lose internet connection or have to stop the form and come back in, they would be available to just type in their save key and go right back in and finish the FAFSA. There's information here about a lot of steps for reading that you can read in terms of completing the FAFSA. I would say in most general cases, you can click directly past this screen and continue on. It will then start in, and I'm going to ask you to take a look at the bar across the top so that you can see the sections of the FAFSA: student demographics, school selection, dependency status. Then we move into parent demographics, parent financials, student financials, and then signing the form. So this bar will keep progress as we move through the form. So we're starting with student information, and here is social security number, first name, last name, and date of birth. If the student entered, if it was the student who came in and entered with their FSA ID, you may come to this screen and see that it is already completed and pre-filled in for you. Then it's going to ask for the student's email address. This is important that students put that in because they will be notified by that email address that their FAFSA has been processed, and that's how they will be able to access their student aid report or their SAR. So important that they put an email address in there and then a phone number as well. Then we'll move on to some additional demographic information about the student: their permanent mailing address, their city, their state, their zip code. So pretty straightforward information that needs to go in there for the student. Then here's an example where it's Iowa, but it will say, have you lived in your state for at least 5 years? So if the students have been residing here in Ohio for a long time, they'll certainly be able to answer that yes. If they're recent people who have moved to the state of Ohio, they will have to say no, and an additional question will pop up about what month and day you became a or month and year you became a resident of the state that you listed as your state of permanent residence. The next question is asking about U.S. citizen, but it is a drop box. So there are choices there about students who may be permanent residents and therefore have a green card. Please remember that if you're serving students who are eligible through the DACA program, DACA students are not eligible for federal student aid and therefore normally do not file the FAFSA due to their ineligibility for federal aid. It will continue to move on again about asking, if you've lived in your state. There are some states, and that's why this sample is here, that have a state application attached to the end of the FAFSA. Ohio does not. Ohio simply uses the FAFSA, so we do not have to kind of worry about that. Then it's going to ask your high school completion status when you begin the school year next year. So they would be indicating if they're graduating this spring that they'll have a high school diploma. Students, though, it is a drop box. If students have a GED, they can indicate that. What college or certificate will you be working on? And that, of course, you can indicate bachelor's degree if they're headed to a four-year institution. Again, it's a drop box option. You'll see things like associate degree there. So they're welcome to choose what kind of credential they're about to pursue. Will you have your first bachelor's degree before the year starts? The answer to that question is going to be no. And then what will your college grade level be for next year? And you always want to enter as a high school senior, never attended college first year. We know we have a lot of students who did things like College Credit Plus and earned college credit while they're in high school. But for the purposes of the FAFSA, you really have never attended college before. That will get students treated like incoming freshmen and reviewed for opportunities of any type of financial aid that may be applicable to incoming students. If you choose one of the other options, then you may appear in the financial aid system as a transfer student and not be considered for all types of freshman aid. Are you interested in being considered for work study? There's a yes, no, I don't know. As you may know, federal work study is a need-based program. It's usually a part-time job on campus, so students can answer that question however they would like. Then we're going to ask about the student's gender, male or female. Please remember that our male students need to register with Selective Service to be eligible for federal student aid. So if you have any of your 18-year-old males who have not registered for Selective Service, they can certainly answer the question, do you want us to register you for Selective Service? So they can actually register for Selective Service through the FAFSA by checking yes to that question. Then it's going to ask about student driver's license information. This is an optional screen really, so if a student doesn't have one, they can move on through, or they can enter or not enter this information. It is really a couple of the optional questions that currently exist on the form. Then we have a question of, are you a foster youth or were you at any time in the foster care system? This is not really a dependency question. This is a general information question for students. The reason that the federal government asked this question is that if the student indicates yes, that they were ever in foster care, there will be some special information that prints out on their student aid report after their FAFSA is finished. So that is really an information gathering question. Then we have highest high school completed by parent one or parent two if there are two parents in the household. This is really information that a couple states use in terms of determining their eligibility for state grants. It is not used in Ohio, but students should answer the question. Other colleges may use the information sometimes if there's special money available for students who are first generation college students. So it's a pretty critical question to answer, but is not going to, have any impact on the processing of the application. Next, we're going to move on to information about what high school that the student attended. So there's an option to type in the name of your high school and what city it's located and what state, and then you can do a search. So we strongly encourage students to do that. And then once they type in the search, it may come up if they typed in a perfect match and there's only one high school with that name in that city, etc. You may not come up with a list, but here's one, for example, where there was a common high school name of West High School in the state of Iowa. So there were multiple West High Schools. So it is really important that your students, if a multiple choice list comes up, that they select the appropriate high school. And that is how sometimes we wonder when we get our list from the state and confirming students who have completed the FAFSA, and we know one of our students has submitted the FAFSA, but for some reason their name is not coming out on the list for your particular high school. Sometimes that has to do because if the student simply types the name in and does not do the search and spells the name of the high school wrong, or particularly if you have a multiple named high school like John F. Kennedy High School and the student types in just Kennedy High School, those are kind of things that can cause the student's name not to come out on your high school list. So when they use the verified list here, it is very likely you will see them come out on your student information list. Okay, after we have confirmed the high school that they've attended, the next question is about what colleges that they're interested in and so what colleges would they like the FAFSA information to be sent to. So again, you have some search options in terms of the state or the city. You can even type in the actual name of the college and hit the search button, and it's going to bring up a list. We want to be very clear that, if students are considering multiple colleges, you need to make sure you get them all on there. If they have a single college in mind, but think there's any possibility out there that it could be something else, we strongly encourage you can list up to 10 colleges on the FAFSA when you file it. So you don't want to be making up colleges, but you certainly maybe, if they're going to just now get started and maybe apply to a four-year institution that still has some openings, and then something happens and they don't get in and they'll maybe decide to attend the local community college, you want to make sure that both of those institutions are on the form. And then like this, depending on what you typed in, you'll get a search box results that come up. And in this case, there was only one school that met the criteria, and that was the University of Iowa. So you would select that school. And then if you need to add more, in the lower right-hand corner, you see the ability to add more schools for those that are going to put in multiple institutions on their FAFSA. Once you have your list of colleges entered, then it's going to ask you about the housing plans for the students. So we have a drop box here again. So the choices would be on campus, which would be, residential, living in campus residence halls. There's an off-campus option, which means the student would be living in perhaps their own apartment. And then there's a with parents option. So for students who are going to be a commuter. So you do have to answer a housing selection for each of the colleges that you placed on the list. Then we're going to move into things about the dependency status for the student. Here is where we are going to determine whether you are dependent or independent for FAFSA purposes. You are going to see the questions that are related to dependency status here in the next few slides. And so I think you'll be able to tell from the questions that the majority of our high school students will be considered dependent, but we will run across students that meet certain criteria that will be allowed to be considered independent and not have to supply any parent information. So the first one is about your student marital status. So again, the majority of our high school seniors will be single. Then it's going to ask the question of, do you have or will you have children who receive more than half of their support from you for this next academic year? So please remember that this is a question to the student. So does the student have a small child who the student will be providing more than half of their support? during the next academic year. So that'll be a yes or no. If it's yes, that can be a criteria that will make the student independent. It also asks if you have other type of dependents other than your children or a spouse who live with you and receive more than half of their support. Fairly rare for any of our high school students to be in this situation, so a lot of no's will be answered on this question. Then we move into questions about the military. Are they currently on active duty, or are they a veteran of the armed forces? For our high school seniors, very likely to be no. At any time since they turned 13, were both of their parents deceased? Were they in foster care, or were they a dependent or ward of the court? So if any of those situations describe the student you're helping, you would check that box. As determined by a court in your state of legal residence, are you an emancipated minor? Ohio doesn't technically have emancipated minors, so typically in Ohio we're answering no to that box. Does someone other than your parent have a legal guardianship as determined by the court? So does someone else other than a parent have official legal guardianship of the student and have legal guardianship paperwork? So if that is the situation, again, you could check that box. And so if any of the boxes on this screen are checked, that will make a student independent. Assuming that none of these situations apply, you would click on none of the above and continue to move on. The next few questions are going to be about students who may be in the situation of experiencing homelessness. And so you will have this question here. Many times if you are serving students that are homeless, you may have a McKinney-Vento liaison in your school district, and that person will be aware and will have designated the student homeless. There'll be a couple other versions of questions. Sorry about that. There'll be a couple other versions of homeless questions asking if the student is an unaccompanied youth and has the director of a shelter or such type of program designated that student as being homeless. If if that is not the case, you'll be answering no to all those questions. So assuming we've said no to all the dependency questions, that means that the student is dependent, and we're going to request that they provide parent information. So they would be clicking on the I will provide information about my parents. If your student is in some very difficult situation where they completely do not have access to parent information, then there is an opportunity here to click the box if I'm unable to provide information about my parents. You will see a little sequence of screens that will come up after that. Please know that if the student checks that box, it will be signaled to the college when they receive the FAFSA, and the student's very likely to get follow-up information from the college requesting some documentation or to understand the circumstances. If the circumstances do not warrant a financial aid appeal, those students who don't provide parent information, the only type of federal aid that they're eligible for is an unsubsidized student loan. So they can't have Pell Grants or other things like that. So it really does need to be a very difficult situation where the student simply does not have access to the parent information, and then perhaps they can do an appeal, and the college may be able to declare them independent. So we often get a lot of questions about that, so I'll stop and do a reminder that if you have questions about things you've seen on the screen so far or general financial aid questions, please make sure you're typing them in the box so that our experts can respond to you. But assuming the student indicates they are going to provide parent information, you can see at the top now we have the parent marital status across the top bar, and we've moved into the parent demographics for the FAFSA. So the question here is going to be the marital status of the parents, and that is the marital status of the parents in the home where the student, one of those parents has custody of the student. So the primary custodial parent. So if that's natural mom and dad and they're married, we simply would be checking married. If it's a case where there's been a divorce and the student is residing with one of their parents and that parent is remarried, that marital status would also be married, and then it's going to ask the month and the year when that marriage or remarriage happened. So you'll need to fill that in. Additional information about the parents, you'll notice on the FAFSA they're going to be referred to as first parent or parent one and parent two. So you're going to have to put in a parent's social security number, their last name, their first initial, their date of birth, and then an email address for the parent should be entered there on the form. Then for the other parent, it's going to ask for social security number, last name, first initial, and date of birth. If any of you are assisting students who have undocumented parents and therefore they don't have a social security number, you can enter their last name and first name and date of birth. In terms of their social security number, you may place all zeros in there. So 9 zeros can be entered for parents who are not documented. Please know that you have to have a social security number to set up an FSA ID. So if you are working on a FAFSA with a student who has undocumented parents, they will not be able to have an FSA ID. But when we get to the end of the form and are covering the different signature options, you will see that there is the ability to print a signature page and have an undocumented parent sign that and mail it in. So certainly possible to get the FAFSA completed. They just are not eligible to sign it with an FSA ID at this point. Parent demographics, again, they're checking parent residency in the state where they've listed. Then it's going to move on to household size. This is trying to determine the number of people in the household who will be counted for the FAFSA purposes. So it comes in the form of a worksheet. So for example, if you've listed that you have married parents, you can see the form will come in already pre-filled in with 2 parents on the form. If you listed a single parent or a divorced parent, you may only see 1 there. And then the second line is the student. Because we obviously are going to be counting that person in the household. So now if there are other people in the household, younger siblings and maybe a older sibling a year or 2 older who's also still in college, things like that, you would be putting those numbers in. And then the worksheet, if you've entered any additional numbers, will do the tally for you. On the sample you see here, you see a household size of 3. The final question on that page then asks how many of the people in this household will be in college during the upcoming year. So in this case, the answer is 1, the student whose FAFSA we are completing. If you're helping a situation where one of the parents is in college or will be in college for the upcoming year, you are not allowed to include parents in the count when you answer the question on the FAFSA. Depending on the circumstances, we encourage you to have the parent reach out to the college that the student attends and asks if they make any adjustments if there's a parent in college. But for the purpose of the FAFSA, you are not allowed to count a parent in college on this particular worksheet. Okay, we're going to move into the parent financial information. So it's asking for 2019, have you already completed your tax return? And so, you know, with the point in time that we are, everybody should either be checking already completed, or again, that's a Dropbox option, and one of the options was not going to file. So if a parent was in the situation where they were not required to file a tax return, they could choose that option. And then what type of form they completed would be the 1040, and then what was your tax filing status? And so there are choices in that drop box like married filing the joint return, married filing separate returns, head of household, single. So there are a variety of options in the drop box. So they would choose the one for the status they used when filing the 2019 taxes. Now, what we strongly recommend a tool that's available in the FAFSA so that families in many cases do not even have to type in answers to their questions regarding their adjusted gross income or taxes paid. You can link inside the FAFSA directly to the IRS. And so you would click click on the link to the IRS tab, and then screens will come up for you to put in identifiers, put in your FSA ID, and then type in the address that you used on your tax return. And we do know it is a bit of a pain, but you have to type the address exactly like it appeared on your tax return. So you are going to maybe want to make sure, if the parents filed, that the tax return is laying there with them as you're working on the form, so that the address can be typed in. Because if you type out the word road and on the tax return they abbreviated it to RD, it's not going to be a perfect match, and it has to be a perfect match to use this. So assuming that you make a perfect match, it will pull the items off of the tax return that match the FAFSA and bring them over and load them automatically into the form, and that will then eliminate some questions that you would see on future screens. So it will use the skip logic to not bring up questions that you were able to transfer information over from the IRS. We so strongly encourage this option if it is available. The reason is that at this point in time, when students are filing the FAFSA, if they can bring their information over from the IRS, while it can't completely eliminate the fact that a student may get selected for federal verification, which will require them to supply some additional documentation to their colleges about their tax information, it reduces the likelihood of being selected greatly. And so at this point, I mean, we are already in the time frame where students are filing typically later in the academic year than they may normally be due to the pandemic. And so in a typical year, they might have had lots of time to resolve any verification issues and be ready to have all their student aid ready to pay the fall term bill. So we just so strongly encourage, if they have the ability to use the IRS data retrieval tool, to do so, and hopefully that'll eliminate them from getting selected for verification, and their FAFSA can be processed and get that aid ready for fall term. However, not everybody's eligible to use the FAFSA or the DRT retrieval tool. For example, if a family filed their tax status was married filing separate forms, a family like that is not eligible to use the DRT, because the DRT can only bring over information from one form, and in that particular situation there are two parent tax returns, and so not everybody is eligible. So if you're not eligible, you know, it is going to give you some options. So here's your linking to the IRS. Then it is going to bring up the parent information questions that will have to be typed in. So for example here, parents adjusted gross income, right? On the form, you're going to see things here like if both parents in the household were working, they're going to ask about earnings for parent one and earnings for parent two. So you would be typing that information in there. If there was only one working parent, you know, for the other parent, you would put a 0 in the box for that. Then it's going to ask about filing a Schedule 1, which is an additional supplement to the regular 1040. So if, you know, you'll have to indicate yes or no whether the family filed a Schedule 1. There are some exceptions there where even if you filed it, you are allowed to answer no, and you see a few things there, like if the only reason you filed a Schedule 1, for example, was to report unemployment compensation or educator expenses or an IRA deduction or student loan interest deduction. We don't have to worry about Alaska, we're not there. Or if there was virtual currency, if those are the only reasons that you filed a Schedule 1, then you can go ahead and answer no. Schedule 1 filing yes or no is used to determine the formula that they use to come out with the expected family contribution. And so it's pretty critical to get that question answered. And then as of today, is either of your parents a dislocated worker? You can click on that and it's going to give you the definition. We certainly are in this situation as a result of the pandemic where several people in the country have lost their jobs or been dislocated. So we may see a lot higher incidence of people answering yes to this question in the current conditions that we are in. Then it's also going to ask in 2019 or 2020, did your parent or anyone else in the household receive any of these federal benefit programs listed below? Medicaid, supplemental security income, SNAP, the free or reduced price school lunch program, temporary assistance for needy families, the WIC program. If you didn't receive any of them, then there is a none of the above. So you would be indicating if the parent or anybody else in the household received any of those programs during 2019 or 2020. Then it's going to ask the amount of income tax paid. So the great thing here, it gives you line references. So if the family has their tax return laying there with them, they can simply look right at the lines referenced and input the information that the question is asking. For parents who filed taxes, this set of questions will come up asking about things like combat pay, any college scholarships and grants that were reported on a tax return. And remember, this is in the parent section, so this would be information about the parents. Any education credits, any untaxed portions of IRAs, IRA deductions and payments, and any tax exempt interest information. And some of these also even have line references on the tax returns. So if these are applicable to the family, they would enter them. If not, the zeros will stand and you can continue to move through. This next few questions, the first one is child support your parents paid. So in the household where the student resides, if there is a parent paying out child support to another household, here's where they would put the grand total of child support that they paid out of the household for 2019. If the parent had any earnings from a co-op program or any earnings from a need-based employment program, like work study, you would put it in here. Again, we're talking about the parents, so it's highly likely that those fields may be zeros. Then we're going to move on to some questions about untaxed income. So here is the opposite question. Was there any child support received in the household? So, and this does not include foster care or adoption payments, but if the student resides in a household where one of the parents is receiving child support for the student who's doing the FAFSA or any other siblings in the household, you would report how much child support was received during 2019. We've got housing, food, and other living allowances. Payments to tax deferred pensions, that's probably one of the most popular ones where there is an answer. If we have parents who are working for school districts, cities, states, the federal government, oftentimes there are payments from their salary that go straight into tax deferred pensions that are for retirement age, and you will be able to find those numbers in box 12 on the W-2. So it gives you the codes there that you would use to report payments to tax deferred pensions, veterans non-educational benefits, or any other type of untaxed income, workman's comp, etc. Would go here on this screen. Let's see. And then depending on how high the family's income is, you may see the asset screen. For most families who file, if their family income is under $50,000, you may not ever even see this asset screen. For families whose income exceeds that, you likely will. It wants to know as of today, what's the total amount of cash available in the form of cash savings or checking accounts. So that's as of the day they're doing the form, they would place that estimated value in there. As of today, the net worth of your parents' investments, not including the home value is not reported on the FAFSA. So stocks, bonds, CDs, other real estate that they may own, you would place the net value in there. And then the net worth of a current business or a farm, you only have to include the business value if you know, the number of employees exceeds 100. So if it's a small business, you would not be reporting the information here in the parent asset section. So we are getting ready to move into the student financial section. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Cody McMillan. Cody?
Thank you, Maura Lee. Good to be with you all this morning. Again, my name is Cody McMillan. I work at the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. I work in admission and financial aid there. So again, happy to be with everyone this morning. So we'll jump right into the student financials section. So it's really, in many ways, is going to mirror the parents' financial section that we just went through. So it's going to ask very similar questions, and so we'll kind of look at these slides here, but we'll go fairly quickly since it is asking some of the same questions. But again, it is going to ask the student if they filed their tax return in 2019. It's going to ask what type of tax return they filed. And then it will give the student the option to, again, do the data retrieval tool from the IRS. So again, we highly encourage students, if they did file taxes, to utilize that tool. Again, there will be some instances where, a student may not qualify to use the IRS data retrieval tool. And so, it will definitely let them know if they're ineligible to use it. But we encourage students to use it, or at least attempt to use it. And again, similar notes to keep in mind, as Maura Lee mentioned, when they are entering their information into the IRS data retrieval tool, they want to make sure to really pay attention to how they filed their taxes, making sure that their information matches exactly what's on their tax return in order to use it most effectively. Next slide. If a student, elects to forego using the IRS, but the IRS data retrieval tool, but they, do meet the really qualifications to potentially use it, they are going to see this screen where it's going to say, hey, based on your responses, we recommend you actually transfer, your information from the IRS into the FAFSA. Again, it's not forcing a student to do so, but it is giving them just a reminder that they might want to try to do that. A student can go ahead and do that, or they can say, no thanks, and then it'll actually go into the next slide. So you can go to the next slide. If they, elect not to use the data retrieval tool, or again, if they are ineligible to use it, they will see very similar questions to, what the parents had to answer. So it's going to ask the adjusted gross income for the student. Again, it's going to give the line item on the IRS form of where they can find that information. Next slide. And then similarly, it is going to ask students about their earnings. And again, it's going to give them, the place on their IRS form, where they can find that information. A student who did not file taxes in 2019, which, if you're working with some students who might have just had a part-time job and really didn't earn enough to, file taxes, would obviously, indicate that they still will be asked, the question about putting in their earnings. And so they would still put those earnings there. So if they received a W-2 form, they could put the earnings that they achieved from their work into this box here. Next slide. And then if they did file taxes, it would ask again the amount of their income tax for 2019. And so again, they can use their tax return form to find where that the answer to that question is located. Next slide. And then again, if they did file taxes, they will be asked similar questions to the parents regarding things like combat pay, education credits. And so again, keep in mind that, the student financials is always highlighted here. So we are always talking about the student in this instance, so not about the parent information. So it's only if these apply to the student. So if a student had an untaxed portion of IRA distribution, they would enter it here. If they didn't, they would put 0. Many students, if they're coming directly from high school, for a lot of these questions are probably going to answer 0. The one thing that sometimes trips some people up is the question about the college grant and scholarship aid that's reported to the IRS as income. Generally, students are not going to report, scholarship and grant aid as income if it's applied towards tuition or other, kind of qualified expenses like supplies or books. generally a student doesn't report that on the IRS. They may report, some scholarship or grant information if it maybe helps towards some of their living expenses or even, housing and meal plan expenses. That can be reported on a tax return. So if they did do that, they would enter that information here. But again, in general, most students are not reporting their scholarship and grant information as income. Next slide. And then additional financial information for a student. So again, these are the same questions that the parents were asked, in terms of child support paid. Here's where a student, really actually might have an answer to some of these questions, particularly if they are a current college student, if they worked at a cooperative education program that was offered by a college and they earned, money by doing that program, they would enter their co-op earnings here. And then similarly, if they were employed at a need-based employment program, so a federal work-study program, which many colleges will offer students who qualify for federal work-study the opportunity to work part-time on campus. So if they did earn income from working in a federal work-study position, they would actually enter that information here. Both earnings from a co-op and earnings from a federal work-study position are not included in the calculation of the expected family contribution number. They're kind of shielded because again, they're related to the student's kind of educational programming versus actually just working kind of a part-time job. So so they would enter that information in those two boxes. Next slide. And then again, untaxed income, they will be asked, again, same questions that the parents were asked with one exception. So again, if, child support received, if they received any money from, being paid if they're in the military or clergy, payments to tax deferred pension programs, veteran non-education benefits, other untaxed income. But the very last question there, may apply to a student. So it's, money received or paid on your behalf, not reported elsewhere on this form. So this could be a situation where maybe a grandparent has set up, for a student that they're going to pay their car payments. And so again, it's not, the student is not necessarily working to earn, this income, but it actually is money that they are receiving on their behalf that is going to help, pay for some of their living expenses, their bills. And so a student could enter that information, here if they have something that is set up like that, where a family member is paying for something on their behalf, a bill or something like that they would put that information there. Again, this would be something that is not a part of a legal child support agreement. Next slide. And then finally, students, will be asked about, asset information, again, for students where this might be pertinent. Again, it's going to ask the same questions about the current balance of their cash savings and checking accounts. And again, this would be as of the day they're completing the FAFSA. Again, it will ask about the net worth of their investments. Again, if a student owns their own home, they would not report the value of their home, but if they own any other real estate, that would be reported here. And then again, similarly, if they own their own business, they would include that here as long as it's not a small business with 100 or fewer full-time employees. Next slide. And then finally, once you get to the student financial section, really you then move into kind of the last step, which would be really signing and submitting the FAFSA. And I do want to emphasize the sign and submit. There are times when a student and family, they complete the FAFSA, they sign it, and then they fail to actually submit it. And so you want to make sure not only is the FAFSA signed, but it's actually submitted. So it does ask if you are a preparer, so which means it would be somebody, so similar, you might hire somebody to complete your taxes for you, and they have information about being a tax preparer. There's a similar thing you could do with a FAFSA. So in most instances, a student and parent is completing the FAFSA themselves, they would say no, they are not a preparer. Next slide. And so what will happen then when you answer that question, you'll actually see a FAFSA summary page. And so this is really, really important. It's a way for, a student and or parent to kind of, view all of the answers to the questions that they have already answered. And so it's a way to kind of check yourself, make sure that, you've answered all your questions correctly. So we highly encourage, sometimes it's easy just to kind of, rush right through this section, but really this is a great way to be able to make sure that everything is correct and completed the way you want it to be completed. So, you can see it's got the student demographic information, it has the school information there. Next slide. Has dependency questions, it has the parent demographic information, has the parent financial information, again, the ways in which the parent and the students answered all of these questions. Next slide. And then it has the student financial information. So again, a great way to kind of review and make sure all the answers to those questions are accurate and correct. And if they are not, you're able to go back and make updates. Next slide. And so then finally, once a student reviews those pages, they will be able to then sign and submit the FAFSA. And so, I think Federal Student Aid has really done a good job of updating this portion of the FAFSA, where it's pretty clear in terms of who needs to sign the FAFSA. So right here, you'll see a screen where both, if this is a dependent student, both the student and the parent signatures are needed. And you can see, it's very clear. It says student signature needed, parent signature needed. It says signature status unsigned, signature status for the parent is unsigned. So it's clear that this FAFSA has not been signed. So next slide. And so when a student goes to sign the FAFSA, so they would click on, under the student, they would say sign. It does give them this information that they should read before proceeding. So really it's a certification that, the information is accurate, that, they're agreeing to some of the stipulations put forward by Federal Student Aid. They would agree to this information and then they would click next and then next slide. And then it would bring up the student signature page. And so it would have the student's information there, and then they would click sign this FAFSA, and then the next slide. And then they would enter, they may be prompted to enter their FSA ID. If they're already kind of logged in, it might be already in there. But then it would say student signed with FSA ID. You would see a check mark. And then you can see now it's updated to, instead of signature status unsigned, it's saying signed electronically. And so now the little green check mark, the student has signed it, but what is still needed is the parent signature. And so, here's where really a parent would need to, so it actually gives you a note. If you're the student and your parent is not present, you would click save and then exit. And then your parent should log into the FAFSA using the student's identifiers and the save key to then sign and submit the FAFSA. So it's encouraging the student to sign off and then the parent to sign on, and then that allows the parent to provide their FSA ID information. Next slide. And so, once the parent clicks, has accessed the student's FAFSA, they would sign in as parent one and parent two. If there's only one parent listed on the FAFSA, it would only give them the option to to sign as parent one. Only one parent needs to sign it, so both parent one or parent two, they both do not have to sign it, but they do want to pay attention to which parent is signing it. So if their financial information, their demographic information is listed as parent one, then they would want to sign as parent one. If they are listed as parent two, then they would want to sign as parent two. So they would just indicate which parent they are. And then the next slide. And then again, they are offered the same information or similar information to this student where they are agreeing to sign this application. They would again click agree, and then next slide. And then they would be prompted to enter their FSA ID. If they've already signed in using the FSA ID, they would not be prompted here, but if they have just accessed the student's FAFSA by using some of those identifiers, they would then be prompted to enter the FSA ID. So they would enter that, and then the FAFSA would be signed. The next slide will show, so if a parent doesn't have an FSA ID, or for some reason doesn't want to use it to sign the FAFSA, they do have the option to print a signature page. So they could actually print out a page, they would sign it, and then they would mail the signature. And that signature page would indicate on the page itself where they needed to sign it. They do have the option to submit without signatures. Eventually, though, they will need to log back in and sign it. So for some reason they want to submit it and just get it done, they could do that. We highly encourage, though, parents and students to go ahead and sign the FAFSA, because it does cause some issues later on. A FAFSA will still be sent to the school, but it will be missing signatures, and so then the college university will reach out to the student and say, you or your parent needs to go sign the FAFSA. We really can't process an award for you until that's completed. So highly encourage everyone, again, to get that FSA ID prior to completing the FAFSA. That way you already have that information. When you get to this point, you can just enter the FSA ID, or again, if you either prefer not to use it, or a parent is unable to access an FSA ID, they can use that signature page and still sign it. So that's what they would indicate here if they want to sign electronically, or go ahead and use the signature page. And then next slide. And then if they did use an FSA ID, it'll show right away that the parent has signed with the FSA ID. You can see the signature status is now updated to sign electronically. And so again, here's where students and families will get to this point, think they're good to go because they see the green check marks, but they're not. They still need to submit the FAFSA. So you can see that button there, submit my FAFSA now. They still need to submit that to actually send the FAFSA to their chosen colleges and universities. So they need to make sure to do that step. Next slide. And then once they do that step, they will see a confirmation page. We do encourage students and families, if they are able, to go ahead and print this confirmation page. That way they have this information on hand, take a screenshot, whatever they want to do with it. But it's just good to have a confirmation that they did indeed submit the FAFSA if there are any issues. There are certain states where you can actually use the information in the FAFSA to go ahead and kind of apply for state aid. Ohio is not one of those states, so really Ohio doesn't have a separate application for need-based aid. Really, they use the FAFSA in order to award need-based aid from the state. So they wouldn't need to worry about that section. There also, it allows a transfer of parents' information into a new FAFSA for a brother or sister of the student. So that's the thing to always keep in mind as well. If a family has multiple students in college, each student has their own FAFSA application. So it's always good to keep in mind that the student is indeed the applicant. And so even though a parent is entering their information, that each student needs to have their own FAFSA. And so it does allow for a parent to transfer their information into a brother or sister's FAFSA, and then they don't have to enter that information twice. The confirmation page also will show the expected family contribution, which is the number the FAFSA produces. And so that's the number that really is used to determine eligibility for various types of financial aid, both from federal sources, from the state, and then from the institutions as well. And then it will also list the schools that were listed on the FAFSA. So again, we encourage families to go ahead and just print that confirmation page or save it somehow. Next slide. And so once a FAFSA is submitted, so they submit the FAFSA, it goes through the federal processing system, and then it is sent out to the colleges and universities that the student indicated. They will actually receive a version of what's called the student aid report, which is really just a report of all of the answers to the questions that the student answered on the FAFSA. And so we're going to talk briefly here about the student aid report and kind of how a student can access it and why it might be important for a student to access it. So next slide. So once a student has submitted a FAFSA, they can log back in again to their FAFSA application, and they would see that, when they log in, they would say, current application status processed successfully. So they know that, hey, they've submitted a FAFSA, it was processed, everything is good to go. They can, if they wanted to, print their student aid reports. You can see the little box that's highlighted there. Where it talks about printing your student aid report. It also gives some other options as well. So if a student, for some reason, needed to make a change to the FAFSA, maybe needed to make a correction or something updated, they realized after they submitted it that they, answered something incorrectly, they can always go back in and make updates. And then similarly, if they didn't use the IRS data retrieval the first time, they can always log back in and use it again and actually transfer the information. So once a student submits a FAFSA, it's not like it's one and done. There's no way to change it. They can make changes from there. But in terms of the student aid report, we actually would encourage students to definitely view the student aid report, but then also potentially print it as well, or again, save it somehow electronically, because sometimes that student aid report will be required as they're applying for outside scholarships. Some outside scholarships might want the student to send that student aid report in. There could be a need-based component to that scholarship, and so they want to view the student's information from the FAFSA. Many organizations that might be sponsoring an outside scholarship don't really have access to the FAFSA information, and so one way that a student can provide that information is through sending that student aid report. Next slide. And so the student aid report, again, is going to really have all of the information that's contained in the student's FAFSA. So it's kind of similar to that confirmation page that was a student reviewed prior to submitting the FAFSA, but it just has the answers to all of their questions. So it has their demographic information, and next slide, has their financial information, has the way they answer their dependency questions, the parent demographic information, parent financial information. Next slide. And you can see it, continues to, so really it is a long form, and that, has all the answers to all the questions that are listed on the FAFSA. And next slide. And then finally, at the end, it actually has, some potential helpful information for the student. So those universities that they listed on the FAFSA, it actually is going to have some information about graduation rates, retention rates, transfer rates from those particular colleges or universities. It also has a link to the college scorecard website, where there's going to be some more complete information reported on those universities. If you're not familiar with this college scorecard website, it's really a website where students can search for, really almost any college or university in the United States that would be accredited, has federally reported information about graduation rates, retention rate, has sometimes information about scholarships, financial aid, the costs, the size of the institution. So a whole lot of information. All that is reported to the U.S. Department of Education, and then it's kind of laid out in a kind of searchable way on the college scorecard. So that's where this information is being pulled from. Then also, if a student is a current student, has taken classes in college before, the student aid report also will have some information if they borrowed any kind of federal student loans. It will list that information there as well. So again, Morley talked about kind of a lot of the federal sites that are connected to federal student aid have all kind of condensed into kind of one place. And so that information from a student's borrowing history from a federal perspective is available for that student to view through viewing their SAR, or student aid report. Next slide. And then finally, you can see at the end, there's the opportunity for, the student to print the page, They can view it as a PDF. Again, they could save that PDF, to a computer, or email it to themselves, or whatever they would like to do. But again, it's just good to have that information in case they would, need to send it somewhere if they're applying for any kind of outside scholarships. And next slide. All right, so we're gonna kind of go quickly through these next couple of sections. Morally kind of reference this, but there's a process called federal verification, and you can go to the next slide. Federal verification is really a process where its intent is to verify the information that is contained in the FAFSA. By using the IRS data retrieval tool, students can potentially cut down on their chances of getting selected for verification because their financial information is coming directly from the IRS, and so really there's not that much information that needs to be verified. If a student or parent elects not to use the IRS data retrieval tool, and in particular if they could qualify for a federal Pell Grant, they could be selected for this process. So roughly 18% of FAFSAs are selected. They're selected by the U.S. Department of Education. However, a college or university could actually choose to institutionally select a FAFSA for verification. If for some reason they're reviewing the information in the FAFSA, they have reason to question something, they could actually request that the student sends in some additional documents. We highly encourage students to, really to take this process seriously because it is going to, hold up either their financial aid award from being awarded or offered to them, or if not that, it may hold up their actual aid from being actually sent to their student account. And so it is a big deal to make sure that they get all the documentation needed that is being requested. So they should respond as quickly as possible to any request for information from the college university. If a student is applying to multiple colleges and universities and they're selected for federal verification by the U.S. Department of Education, they are going to need to send the documentation that's requested to each college or university they are applying to. So they're actually sending it to the college versus sending it to the federal processor. Next slide. In general, what a student typically has to complete if they're selected for verification would be something called a verification worksheet. While typically these verification worksheets collect the same information, they can look different depending on the college or university. So you may have a different looking form that a student has to complete at each college, but in general it's going to really collect some information about the tax filing status of the student and the parents, and then also the number of people in the household and the number of people in college. So if you remember, the student and parent had to answer that question in the FAFSA. And so really this federal verification worksheet is verifying that the answer to that question is indeed correct. And so that verification worksheet, they would, again, the school, college, university would provide that to them. Typically they do that through some type of online portal. And so they can obtain that information there. Depending on the college or university, they would submit the verification information either directly through the portal, so they would kind of complete the form online and electronically sign it and then submit it, or they may have the option to print out the form and then send it via mail. We do encourage students to try not to use email to send some of this information, just because email is not a very secure method of sending personally identifiable information like tax returns and things like that. And so typically most colleges and universities will have some type of online portal where they can upload documents. So they typically would have to complete a federal verification worksheet, and then they would have to provide, if they file taxes, some type of documentation for that. So that could be a federal tax return transcript that they actually order from the IRS, or a federal tax return. And so it could be just a signed tax return, just a copy of their 1040. They could send in to, again, what that's doing is just verifying that the financial information for either the student or the parent is accurate, is actually what is contained in their tax return. For parents or students, if they worked in 2019 but they did not file taxes, they would have to send in W-2s if they have them. And then for parents and independent students, if they did not file taxes in 2019, they actually have to fill out a 450XT form, which actually is a verification of non-filing. So they complete that form, and then a verification of non-filing letter is sent to them that they then in turn can send on to the college university. So they basically are confirming that they indeed did not have to file taxes in 2019. Students that are dependent do not have to complete this form. So even if a student did not file taxes in 2019, they do not have to worry about completing that form. This is only for parents who did not file taxes, and then independent students. So those students who met some of those criteria that Maura Lee talked about, they would have to do this process if they did not file taxes. But dependent students, even if they did not file taxes, do not have to obtain the verification of non-filing. Next slide. So, again, encourage students to complete that verification process as soon as they are able, because again, it is going to, hold up some things in terms of either being made aware of the financial aid they qualify for, or even the financial aid actually being credited to their account. Also, they would want to complete that process, the verification process, because if there are any special circumstances that a student or family is going through, and their FAFSA has been selected for verification, they're going to have to complete the verification process first before they do anything regarding their special circumstances. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But for special circumstances, really, we all know, as Maura Lee talked about, so the FAFSA is collecting information really from 2 years ago at this point, so 2019 for the 21-22 FAFSA. And so that, the tax return that they filed in 2019 may not be indicative of their current family situation. Income may have changed, number of people in dependents that they claimed on their taxes. I mean, all those things could be very different. Their marital status could have changed since 2019. So there is a way for students and families to let colleges, universities know that the information contained in the FAFSA maybe doesn't quite meet their current status. They still want to file the FAFSA as asked, so they still want to enter in their 2019 tax information. They would put in all of that in there as the FAFSA is asking. But then on the back end, once this FAFSA is submitted, they can potentially do this special circumstance process where they are letting a college university know that the information on their FAFSA isn't quite accurate. And they would do that really through the college or university that they are applying to, or where they're currently attended. So you can see some examples there of those special circumstances that can't be documented on the FAFSA. So something like a loss or reduction of employment, wages, loss of untaxed income or benefits, such as child support, again, separation, divorce, or death after the FAFSA was submitted. So all of those things that, again, may be true of the family now, but weren't necessarily true of the family in 2019. And you can see there, these are some of the other circumstances that the student might be going through. It could even be something like unusual uncovered medical or dental expenses. So again, that is not information that the FAFSA collects, but the family may have had some unusual medical or dental expenses in the past year that the insurance is not covering, and obviously it impacts their ability to pay for college. And so it could even be something like dependent care. So maybe a grandparent is living with the family, and they have unusual expenses related to their care, again not covered by insurance. That could be something that could warrant a special circumstance. And so really the student would work with the college or university regarding that particular special circumstance. There might be a form that needs to be completed, a special circumstance form is what it's called. It could collect certain information. The parent and student typically have to sign it, and then documentation has to be provided as well. And so that's a thing to keep in mind, is that a parent can complete, or a student can complete the special circumstance appeal, but a college definitely will probably want to see some actual documentation of some of these things. And so the college university will really have some guidance in terms of what documentation would be required. It could be something like for maybe a loss of wages, like an updated pay stub. And so the the college university can see that, okay, yeah, indeed, the wages that the parent or student is receiving, is very different than what their, tax return was in 2019. So documentation is really important, but that is a way to really kind of allow really the college university's financial aid office to go in and make updates to the FAFSA, based on that updated information. And that can lead to a student or family, potentially qualifying for some additional financial aid. And next slide. So in terms of resources, really OASPA, our website has a lot of good resources related to the FAFSA, related to financial aid. So if you go to oaspa.org, you can actually see there's both a resources tab, particularly for counselors and college access information, college access professionals, information about various workshops. These slides, as was mentioned, will be available on the counselor resources page at OASPA. But then there's also a section called FAFSA Help Ohio. And so really this is a section that's a little bit more kind of student and family facing, where there are resources and tools really about the FAFSA. And then also the opportunity for students and families to learn about trainings that are on the FAFSA that are held throughout the state. So next slide. So if there are any kind of FAFSA completion events, whether those would be virtual or in person, you actually have the ability to add your event to this page. So there's a way for you to submit a form, and that event could get added. But then also it's a resource for students and families as they're searching for any kind of trainings or webinars connected to the FAFSA. They can find out where a training might be happening, either again in person with them or potentially a virtual training. And then there are those resources, as I mentioned, for students and parents. There's instructional videos, there's handouts. You can actually, if you work at a school or a college access organization has a website, you could actually even link this to your website. That way families can find this information fairly easily. Next slide. OASPA, the outreach committee, we actually can help facilitate your school or organization's financial aid night. So financial aid night would be a little bit different from a kind of a FAFSA webinar. A FAFSA webinar typically is very similar to what we're doing here, where really you're going kind of line by line through the FAFSA. You may even have a place where people are at a computer lab or something where they're able to actually complete the FAFSA on site. A financial aid night really is more of a general overview of financial aid. So just really talking about the importance of filing the FAFSA, talking about what are scholarships, what are grants, how do loans work, all of that. If you're looking to do some type of program like that, would encourage you to, you can request a presenter. We have a network of financial aid professionals across the state that would be happy to come to your school organization and deliver that presentation. You can also download a financial aid night presentation. So we've actually recorded a presentation. So if you don't want to have someone come to your school or in person, or again, maybe you're doing something virtually, you can actually upload that video and just show that video, and that would be a presentation of a financial aid night. So I encourage definitely you all to take advantage of that. And then if you are a high school counselor or work at a college access organization, would encourage you to sign up for our counselor database. So actually we'll keep you on the list of trainings like this one, where we'll send out notifications of trainings happening all throughout the year so that you can sign up. We hope to have some more kind of in-person trainings for next year. I know this year everything was kind of virtual. We anticipate continuing to do virtual trainings. But we also hope to have some in-person trainings as well. But definitely encourage you to sign up for that database. That way you're in the know of all the trainings that are happening across the state. And next slide. And that's it. So we've got about 3 minutes to spare. I don't know if there are any, I know questions have been being answered all throughout the presentation. I don't know if any of my co-presenters or co-presenter or financial aid experts, if there's any questions that we should answer, live here. But if there are any, someone just shout those out and we can try to answer.
Cody, our experts, Mary and Vicki, have done a great job, and they have answered all the questions as folks type them in the box throughout the presentation. So knowing we would be cutting it close to the 90 minutes, thank you all for typing your questions in there, and thanks to Mary and Vicki for supplying the answers. Please remember that anytime you have questions, financial aid questions, and you're looking for an answer, the email address outreach@owasfa.org. We're available to answer questions that you may have anytime throughout the year, so please feel free to use that resource. On behalf of OASFA and the Ohio Department of Higher Education, we thank you for attending today's training. We hope you feel better positioned to assist your students and families with the FAFSA and answering questions about FAFSAs as they attempt to complete them. We know the FAFSA completion process is going to be one that is happening probably right up until the start of fall enrollment. So if you have questions or things over the summer, please feel free to use that outreach@owasfa.org email address, and we will continue to try to provide answers and support to you. So thank you again for joining us today, and a reminder that this recorded webinar and the actual slide deck will be available up on the counselor resource page at owasfa.org starting on May 20th. Thank you for attending.